So, Zack Polanski, the left's answer to Nigel Farage, the populist, the thinking man's economist, the man with all the answers. Is he going to deliver us from evil? Well, we're going to talk about that today and more in this episode of More Through Margins.
Right, Adam, so before I let you lay into Zack Polanski, because having seen your social media, I have a feeling that's what you're going to do. I thought we should probably give him his voice. So let's hear a little bit about what he's actually saying, because he often complains that he doesn't get the chance to put his views across.
Well, like so many issues, Thatcher was talking absolute nonsense because it's not other people's money, it's Bank of England money. And actually anything we can do, we can afford. And we know that investing in our public services creates something called spending multipliers. For every pound we spend, that is creating more money that's going around our economy. The way to destroy the economy is exactly what we're talking about here, which is to store money in assets, making the inequality gap even wider. Poor people getting poorer, rich people getting richer, and problems within society, our social structures are completely falling down.
Would people...
Spend more money. We need to spend. We need to not be keeping our money stored away in assets, as he calls it. And here's Zack on how we could raise some more money.
If you're not a multimillionaire and billionaire, keep scrolling. Guys, now you're here. I want to have a chat. Look, our country is in trouble and we need to fund our public services. You guys have got a lot. We're just asking for a little bit of it. A 1% tax on your assets of £10 million or more, or 2% on £1 billion or more, could be about 15 to 25 billion pounds we put straight into our economy. By the way, if you don't do this, we're going to take it anyway. So let's just do it nicely. Cool, thanks. Everyone else, you can come back now. Bye.
That was Zack's message, particularly, I think, probably to you, Adam, asking you to give him 1 or 2% of your assets. And good idea?
I'm not convinced that I qualify yet, Duncan, unfortunately, but when I do, I'll be sure to write to Zack and just volunteer that, of course. I mean, there's a few problems, isn't there? Let's face it. Well, we've talked before about how when you're in that sort of bracket, you tend to be fairly flexible as to where you live. You probably already own half a dozen properties around the world in wonderful locations. You're not married to anywhere, and the idea of a tax on that, for a start, what Rachel Reeves did with the non-doms and what Jeremy Hunt was doing with the non-doms didn't make an awful amount of sense. There's a sense of fairness, I think, in what Zack's trying to do, but it doesn't mean that it economically translates to smart ideas realistically. So one of the chief problems is really, I don't know if Zack would know this, because he embarrassed himself a little bit, I thought, when he was on The Rest is Politics, which I think is a fairly soft gig, to be honest. I mean, Alistair Campbell, you know where he is. Rory Stewart, you know where he is. But they're both largely centrist. Alistair's obviously a proud lefty, but he's not a far lefty like Zack. And he let Rory do the heavy lifting. And Rory's economic figures are not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But Zack kind of proves he doesn't really do maths that well. And you'd probably prefer Diane Abbott in charge, to be honest with you. So I think, raising 25 billion, even if it did, which it wouldn't, right? But raising 25 billion, Zack's not really given any thought to the fact that that's going to be less than 2.5% of government spending. So increasing things by less than 2.5% is not going to be a big material difference. It's largely what happens in real terms every year anyway, Duncan, with the tax that we already raised. So one of the fundamental failings is understanding how tax works and where it largely comes from. And, the big tax contributors being income tax and consumption taxes. And that's not just in the UK, that's around the world in regimes that levy their taxes one way or another.
But the other side of his argument, Adam, is we have this thing, the Bank of England. It belongs to the public. There's stacks of money in the Bank of England. Why don't we just spend some of that on making our country better?
Yes, nothing wrong with just printing money when we need some money. I mean, Zack, again, I'm not sure if he's too into the technicals. I don't really think that he is from what I've read or what I've heard from him. But he probably fits rather broadly into the category called modern monetary theorists, which is kind of like, there's no magic money tree apart from when there is. And to an extent, they do have a point, because if a pandemic comes along, the bond markets are all very understanding about there being any need for any money. But the concept that we just spend money on public services and it multiplies around the economy, again, it's Jack and Jane economics a little bit. He would fit into the Keynesian school, and it would make sense, apart from his political allegiances, it would make sense that he would deride Thatcher specifically because she brought monetarist economics to the UK, just as Ronald Reagan did with his voodoo economics in the US at the time. So Keynesianism says the state spends, especially in times of need. So the Keynesian way out of 2008 would have been to borrow more and spend more and create jobs. And look, we, spend money on infrastructure. Boris Johnson wanted to spend 625 billion on infrastructure before COVID came along. It would have been a good idea, depending on how it was funded, depending on what infrastructure, because, we talked about projects. People may remember things like the Humber Bridge that was billed as the bridge to nowhere back in the 70s. There are many, many white elephants that have happened. Boris himself was criticised for Boris's bridge and things that didn't happen on a mayoral level in London when he was in charge. So you can't just spend and hope for the best. You need to invest in projects with what we call a positive net present value, with a positive return, and also with a positive societal return.
Yeah, I mean, but our perception to public debt, I think, has changed over the years, right? Because we have seen countries borrow and spend more money, especially developed countries, without really suffering severe consequences. I mean, our public debt has been rising over the years, and it doesn't seem like there's too much of a problem there. So, is that something that's a legitimate question?
Well, I think it's not a problem until that problem really rears itself. All fiat systems over history, apart from the one we're currently operating within, have gone broke, right? The Weimar Republic was a thing. It did happen. We do need to bear in mind there isn't just the problem with the MMT school, the modern monetary theorists, is they kind of make out like the taps can just be turned on forever. And I would argue we've got a small problem with servicing £110 billion worth of debt every year, the second biggest amount of spending that we're doing behind third behind welfare and health, right, is debt servicing. That's not great. We could be spending that money on better stuff. If you look at Norway, who still have a 30 to 40% of GDP debt and a sovereign wealth fund that represents a greater percentage of their GDP than that, they haven't got this lag and they can spend quite happily. But they also implemented a wealth tax, which, interestingly enough, Zach, didn't work, right? Because people went to Switzerland instead, where, interestingly, Switzerland have a wealth tax, but it's a wealth tax. It's offset against things like very low income taxes, especially in certain cantons. And there's an overall tax landscape picture. It's kind of, the whole wealth tax versus income tax versus consumption tax, which actually the third one we never really talk about, and we really should, but we don't, probably because it's not very sexy, apart from anything else, right? That's a worthwhile debate. The problem with the Zack school is it's just like layer more and more and more and more on, and the more you've got, the more you have to give. And from an incentive perspective, you either don't stick around because you feel I'm kind of paying my fair share anyway, and we'd probably move on to, the tax the rich lie. It is an outright lie. That the idea that the rich don't pay tax is just laughable. It's like a shadow. It's a straw man, Duncan, at the highest order.
Sounds like you've been doing quite a lot of research into the tax system in Switzerland, Adam. It's not something you've been planning. To come back, though, I mean, you talked a bit about history and how perceptions have changed over history. And the moment we're in now really does feel a lot like a sort of transformational moment for the economy. We moved maybe over the last 50 years in the UK, something like that, from a sort of manufacturing economy to much more of a services-oriented economy. Before that, we moved from a kind of, over the 100 years maybe before that, from an economy which was powered by human labor to an economy that was powered by machines. Right? And in the next, 5 years? Is it 10 years? We're going to move into what I would call a truly digital economy, where a lot of the work is not even being done by machines, but a lot of work is being done digitally, virtually almost. And that transformation, I mean, I would argue we can possibly almost see it right now in the unemployment figures. The firms are saying, hey, we don't need as many people as we used to do. It's going to fundamentally change the way that we live and the way that we work. So is there an argument to say we also need to fundamentally change the way that we tax, the way that we think about how we fund our lives?
I mean, I think there is, and I think we should get into it. I think, first of all, I'm just going to take slight issue with the fact that AI is already impacting unemployment figures. Half the jobs that have been lost in the United Kingdom since the announcement of the employer's national insurance contribution rise have been in hospitality. Now, 0 of those have been replaced by AI or augmented by AI, right? A big fat 0. It's a people-heavy industry where people cost too much now and their jobs have had to go. And business rates are bleeding, hospitality business is dry. And you only have to look. It's not a lie. Dan Needle, who I respect quite a lot, tax expert, said no one's business rates were going to go up more than 15% after the budget. What he hadn't factored in was the fact that there was a business rates revaluation for 2026. And there have been all sorts of posts of pubs where their business rates are going up 70%. This is not a time when they can sustain that, Duncan. So that's half of all the jobs that we've lost. And in fact, if you subtract the public sector figures where we have been creating jobs, and this is where the US and the UK unemployment figures differ quite a lot, although people say, well, we're both trending upwards, it's not really Labour's fault. In the UK, we are adding jobs to the public sector year on year, primarily in health and social care, apart from anything else. In the US, they are shedding jobs in the public sector and the private sector is creating them. Our private sector is not creating them, it is shedding them. So that is political and based on political decisions. And I don't think we've yet seen AI have the impact that it will. I'm bullish on AI in terms of I believe it will net create jobs. All of the sensible analysis and commentary that I've read says that. None of it as yet has addressed the pace at which those two things move. And I do accept we could see quite a bit of shedding before we see the net job creation, because as you alluded to, we were in the fields for hundreds and hundreds of years, Duncan, before capitalism effectively saved things. And we do need to remember that. And I'm not a free market advocate for unfettered, no rules and all the rest of it. I think you need tight regulations that are clear, but most importantly are enforced. And that's the bit where we've let ourselves down in the United Kingdom for 50 years plus, is actually enforcing the law. What we do, just like we have with the Renters' Rights Act, is we make new laws instead when we're not enforcing the existing ones. And that's not the right way to do things, right? But ultimately, yes, are we in a time of absolutely massive change? Is the pace of change quite frightening? Yes, I think it is. But let's put into context, the LLM was released in October 22, GPT, I think. So we've had 3 and a bit years already. And whilst we've seen, what do we see in front of our faces online? They say 50% of all content now on the internet is generated by AI. We all like to think we can see it all coming. I can promise you this is the real Adam Lawrence and the real Duncan Hooper right now, right? But soon maybe we will be augmented in a conversation like this by AI. I don't know, but I do believe there will be significant job creation. What happened when the biggest invention of the 20th century in terms of the way it distorted the labour market was a washing machine. So if you look to, there's a lot of talk these days about it's much harder to make it in middle class America than it was before. But the employment stats are loosely, roughly the same. Wage stats have moved on roughly with inflation. Okay, I grant that house prices have changed immeasurably in certain areas. There's no denying any of that. But ultimately, the makeup of the labour force has changed because there's more women in there, right? That's what that was enabled. That childcare enables that as well. Although not so much in the UK because it's so expensive apart from anything else.
I'm going to get a T-shirt made, Adam, with we were in the fields for hundreds of years before capitalism saved us. I think that,
Good.
That should be your slogan, definitely.
I thought we should launch some merch, actually, Duncan. It'd be a good idea. I'm sure we have some buyers. I'm sure we'll have some buyers.
Make that the tagline for the podcast. There's a lot of areas we can go into. I mean, but maybe we'll keep them for future episodes, and the idea of the universal basic income and there's some other things too. But I think probably it's time now to move on. So we're coming up to the end of the year, Adam, and I'm sure that's the time when you sort of look around and think, okay, what do I need to do quickly before we get to January the 1st? What's top of your to-do list in the next couple of days before the Christmas frenzy hits?
Well, my handy item over here, Dunk, this week is a dustpan and brush, because there needs to be some housekeeping done by myself and by all other landlords out there. We've got a big change on the horizon, already legislated, the Renters' Rights Act, as we know. And some of the big things I think that people listening to this might need to concentrate on are considering their rents. Apart from anything else, there's going to be a new way that rents can be challenged by tenants. Rent increases can be challenged. And that's going to be quite a big deal. It's almost a no-lose situation for the tenant. So I think when that message gets across, however it does, whichever lobby group or whatever manages to get that across to the tenant, it's going to be an awful lot harder to raise rents. And people can find themselves stuck. There will be still a few people listening to this who've got some mortgages that they fixed in 2021 in the days of sort of 3% or even cheaper for buy-to-let landlords. Lucky homeowners were fixing at things like 0.75 and 1% and things like that. 2026 is the year of it's the worst move of them all in terms of the low to where the interest rate will be. Even though things have normalized a bit now, we've had another base rate cut this week, it's still going to be a bit of a shock to people. So if that's going to happen to you in 2026 and you need to put the rent up, you're going to need to make sure you've done that before the 1st of May 2026 to ensure that you've got that continuity and that safety of revenue stream. There's no two ways about it. Lots and lots of landlords that I've been talking to, Duncan, who are portfolio landlords, are reviewing any remotely difficult tenants and serving Section 21 notices on them because they're worried that when they've got greater security of tenure under the Renters' Rights Act, they won't be able to get rid of them. So it's almost a better the devil you know / clean house while you can. I take evictions really, really seriously. Unfortunately, we've done several dozen of them. Almost exclusively, it's due to non-payment of rent. Sometimes we use Section 21, although largely we've stuck to Section 8, and then we pursue the funds through money claims in order to get county court judgments and things like that, so people know they're bad covenants. It's one of those unfortunate things. The system gets abused on both sides. It won't be abused anymore on the landlord side because you will have to say what the fault is, or you'll have to be selling the property. And I think there's lots of people, I put a few posts on social media, and there's still a broad feeling that if landlords sell properties, that's good. And if they sell them to first-time buyers, I agree that is good. It's good for the first-time buyer, but it's not good for the new renter coming into the marketplace who hasn't got a unit to rent. And that's the problem that people don't necessarily get their head around so well. So this is the time when we've got to use those quiet few days or couple of weeks or whatever to make sure a full strategic review for next year must include rent increases. I think student landlords need to look at tenure and decide whether they're going to keep doing student properties or not because of the vastly increased risk there is now to the no more fixed term tenancies. And ultimately, you've got to look at the composition of your tenant type and work out whether under renters' rights, does it work? I'd like to say one more thing, if I could. That was my 3 points that's going to become 4. The 4th thing is going to be around damp and mold. And I think what people need to be doing is very much reviewing what they do when damp and mold is announced by a tenant. There are various bits out there on the internet that suggest 90+% of this is lifestyle. I can tell you we've had times in the past where one tenant has left, property's been perfect, new tenant has moved in, suddenly it's riddled with black mold. It's unlikely that anything's changed other than the only variable that's changed is the tenant. So there are lifestyle issues around that and educational pieces, unfortunately, around damp. The BBC have actually done some quite good Instagram stuff on this, which is worth sharing. If anybody's listening to this, share that with your tenants, gives them a few tips. But any response other than immediately installing things like positive input ventilation systems is not going to be acceptable under the new law. So you're going to have to be prepared for extra infrastructure spend. Every refurbishment we'll be doing from now on will have a positive input ventilation system in. If anybody doesn't know, it takes cold air from the loft, pumps it through the house, costs very, very small amount to run, but it makes sure that there's airflow even when people don't open their windows. And some people don't open, and I understand why they don't, because ultimately the heating bills are high and they're worried about it. But if you don't keep airflow moving, of course, damp and mold will come, but also it's just not healthy in that house, Duncan, if you're not having airflow changes, often enough. So landlords are going to need to think about how they respond to all of that stuff.
Yeah, and we have promised, and we will do an episode on how you can communicate with your tenants, because as you say, this is often something that's best done by the tenant in terms of resolving this issue as well as the landlord. Just to come back on that though, you're essentially saying that you think landlords essentially need a protocol. They need to basically write down, what do you do? What is your process when people report this, rather than just treating it as, okay, we'll deal with it when it happens?
Absolutely. And I think being proactive, and that's why I say fitting them during refurbishment. If you buy properties that need refurbishment, is the only sense you're going to upgrade the EPC envelope realistically these days because of energy performance changes. that still haven't been legislated, Duncan, but I'm hopeful we might see something in 2026 in terms of certainty on that front. But it's future proofing, essentially. And I see what larger corporations are doing and are spending an average of about 50k per property on a refurb, which is including things like humidity monitoring, damp monitoring and things like that. One of the problems there'll be is that tenants will be accused of not heating the house to a sufficient level because the money's not going on the gas bill, it's going somewhere else, unfortunately. But of course, the institutional mindset says if you give them a much better, much warmer, much more efficient house, then apart from anything else, guess what? You can charge them more rent because their bills are lower. And that's the unspoken institutional rule of making sure you deliver good properties. But of course, institutions have reputational risk and they have to think about things like that as well. And it is quite commercially sensible when you're doing an entire refurbishment, make sure it's set for the next 20, 25 years rather than anything could go wrong with it.
And the first point you brought up was around the rent increases and how you justify them. How will you be able to justify rent increases after, was it May the 1st, you said? Yeah.
Well, they're going to be set against the market rent. And of course, if there are fewer units on the market rent will go upwards anyway. I think we haven't got details yet about how that system's actually going to work, Duncan. In Scotland, they look at it and say, look, it's not the market rent of a new property because the tenancy's been going on for 3 years, let's say. So we'll give a bit of a discount allowance for that, which 90% of landlords or 99% of landlords, I think, already give that allowance for an existing tenancy. But it's one thing saying your rent is X and it's fixed there for 10 years, which doesn't really help anybody, to be honest with you. And it's another thing moving it upwards, but not up to the full market rent every year, which is something that we've always done and something that we'll continue to do. So that's how it's gauged. How it will be assessed at the rent tribunals or whatever system they finally do come up with will be anyone's guess. But ultimately, the cost of delivery, since I've been doing this, has just gone up and up and up and up and up. We've now got landlord registers to comply with. There's more and more selective licensing schemes. You know, these are at hundreds and thousands of pounds of cost. To think that zero of that would be passed on to the tenant, you know, if the price of wheat goes up, the price of bread in the supermarket goes up, right? It is the same logic. I appreciate it's a service and not a good, but this is really economics 101, folks, right? If the price of the inputs go up, the price of the output goes up.
And what are these, you mentioned tribunals that are going to hear this, because that's going to be really important, isn't it? Those first few cases that come through and people see, okay, how are they making these judgments? How's that going to work exactly in practice?
Yeah, well, they're not largely. I mean, Scotland, where I'm already familiar with this system, it's not a matter of public record. So it's not like legal precedent is set at the tribunal. What happens is what happens. They're inherently fair. They have someone representing the tenant. They have a tenant representative, which might be CAB or someone like that. And they'll have a landlord representative, probably a member of a landlord association. And then they'll have not a magistrate, that's the wrong word, but a character, an arbitrator of sorts who's supposed to be neutral. Both arguments will be put forward. Everything will be considered. I will say, whenever I've been to rent tribunals or been involved in rent tribunals in Scotland, they do seem inherently fair to me. But, you know, I'm fairly relaxed on, I don't expect to get full market rent for every increase every year. I don't think that would be fair on the tenant. I'm a bit soft like that, which probably isn't that much room for softness anymore post the 1st of May 2026. But no, I think where I would agree with Zack, interesting enough, is fairness is important, right? But that means you need to be fair to everybody, not just the people at the bottom of the spectrum, unfortunately.
Excellent. So yeah, just quick recap then, Adam. So you said 4 things for landlords to think of before the end of the year.
So rent increases before 1st of May 2026 under the old processes. I'm going to highlight the damp again right up front, because your reaction to when damp and mold is reported cannot just be, you need to open the windows, mate, or whatever. You need to take it much more seriously. You need to show best practice. It's going to be really, really important. Cleaning house around any tenants you think might be difficult to move on, or there's suggestions of antisocial behaviour, or who, frankly, let's face it, you wouldn't actually trust in a system of more secure tenure. And also, I think student landlords specifically need a full strategic review of their portfolios to work out whether they're going to continue to house students or are going to look more towards either social housing HMOs or professional HMOs.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. It sounds like you've got plenty to be doing over the next few days. Right, so our person of the week, this very handsome fellow behind me, is Lonan O'Herlihy, who I'm sure, Adam, you remember from the 2015, I think, series of Made in Chelsea, which...
I've actually got a picture of him on my wall as well, Duncan. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely, which I know you watched all of those. And he's been in the news because he wants £5 million from the estate of his mother's ex-boyfriend, who he says was essentially his stepfather for several years. And he sent a list of things that he feels he needs to maintain his lifestyle to the man's wife. And he's having hard times apparently, and he's living on couches and things because it's a tough business being a former celebrity. Although maybe that's unfair, maybe that's libelous to him. Perhaps I should say he's still a current celebrity because we're talking about him. But anyway, what he wanted was a £3 million property in South Kensington. He wanted a 1969 Mercedes 280 SL Pagoda, which I'm told is worth £250,000, according to the Telegraph. He wanted a Patek Philippe watch, although it's not specified which one. A Melchior de Hondecoeter painting. Melchior de Hondecoeter, as you will know, is a 17th century Dutch artist who specialised in painting birds. And then he wanted £800,000 to buy an investment property. So you've got $3 million in South Kensington. You've got a 1969 Mercedes classic car. You've got a luxury Patek Philippe watch. You've got a classic painting from the 17th century, or you've got £800,000 investment property. Which one are you taking, Adam, pound for pound, as the best investment there?
Well, I'd probably cheat here, Duncan, and say I'll take the 3 million property, sell it, and then put it into investment property.
But I'm talking pound for pound, Adam. So you can't do that. You've got to put the money down, and you can keep I'll give you the money, but you can only keep the return, right?
Okay, so Kensington probably quite likely to struggle. It has been struggling in the very top boroughs in London, the Camdens, the Westminsters, the Kensingtons have seen their asking prices of properties down 10% year on year. Doesn't mean the properties dropped 10% in value, but the mansion tax hasn't helped either. So let's face it, he's going to be taking on a £2,500 a year extra bill for running that property as well, whether he rents it out or whether he doesn't, even if he lives there. So we'd also have to bear that in mind. I don't think
how he'll pay that.
I don't think there's a, well, he'll get it out of the estate, I'd imagine, because he needs it for his lifestyle. But I don't think that there's necessarily great pound for pound returns to be made on that in the near future. And some of this and a lot of this discussion, I think, will revolve around hostility towards wealthy people, because things like the classic car, the Merc, they've seen huge increases in value over the past 15 years, and people I know who are into that sort of stuff and have traded them and things like that have also benefited from the fact there's no capital gains tax. So this has been a very, very nice store of wealth and value. But if we are, going back to your point around shifting society and all the rest of it, going to really start attacking the rich in this country, people aren't going to want these trophy assets. It's going to cause more problem than it has done. And they've had outsized performance since 2008. It might be time for that performance to revert back to the mean. So I'm not sure that will keep going up from its 250k. But of course, it does get scarcer every year. And there are still people who have collections and they go into collections. That's one fewer that's ever going to be out there in the wild. So I guess there's still probably some appreciation there on the Merc. The Patek, it's as good as it was. It's one of those brands, isn't it? It's been around for a very long time, always thought of in my lifetime as one of the most very exceptional watches. Don't have the most expensive watches in the world anymore, but generally speaking, a phenomenal brand, a phenomenal investment. A lot of the stuff around watches that I see is created by false scarcity, really, Duncan, and the right influencer wearing the watch. So given his track record, if he puts the Patek on, it might lower the value of Patek Philippe. Who knows? But they do say you don't own it. You look after it for future generations. I think that's one of their branding lines that sticks in the mind quite a bit. So, but the watch is going to suffer from the same societal factor as the car. It's a lot easier to move, though, than a car. So you can get on a plane and go to Dubai. Perhaps that's where Mr. O'Hurley is going with his fortune if he gets it. And he can take the Patek with him, and it'll probably trade at a little bit of a premium over there. So that might be the best of the rest. But of course, I'm going to pick the investment property out of all of them. Yeah. Having said that, though, if he's going to spend £800,000 on one property, he's going to have a huge amount of stamp duty to pay, which is going to take him years to recoup realistically in rents. And he's probably buying something with a comparatively low yield. He might be buying a commercial property with a nice FRI lease in place, and it might tick along very nicely at a 7 or 8% yield with CPI or RPI linked inflation clauses. I'm not sure how sophisticated he is, and I don't want to put any value judgments on him. I suspect he might need some advice, and if he does, he knows where to come. He can come to Proponomics. As for the painting, difficult, isn't it? I don't think we're likely to discover suddenly 400 years later there's going to be a massive increase in value in a slightly more minor Dutch artist. Maybe I'm revealing what a culture vulture I am or not here, Duncan. But I don't see dramatic changes in that. But art is a very different market, and it has moved along over the years, and it's a bit less status symbol wealth and a bit more cultured, slightly niche, I suppose. I always see fine art at the top level, and we don't know how much the painting is worth, but I always see that as kind of a preserve of the people who've got so much money they really don't know what to do with it. So whether it goes up or whether it goes down, you'd have to ask an expert on that one. But if you invest the 800k wisely, I think pound for pound, he's probably going to do better. But things like the watch, if it's going to appreciate, you're not paying tax on that appreciation as a general rule. It's going to be a chattel. So if you're staying in the UK, that's a nice little bit of a discount. Whereas on property, you're going to pay tax left, right and centre. I
would ask you, just as a quick answer to finish, Adam. So I gave you £800,000 to spend on an investment property. What are you going to spend it on?
So if I've got to spend it on one property specifically,
no.
Right.
How would you spend it?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I would buy a portfolio of properties with that, Duncan. I would roll that up I would make quite a significant amount of money on the way in. That 800,000 would give anybody who knew what they were doing, 3 million plus quid's worth of possibility of purchasing power, which could be a portfolio of 30 properties worth 100 grand each with a rent roll of £300,000. That's something that could happen. Obviously, what you'd want to do is try and negotiate a discount against the value, and that would be the big win that you would have. It wouldn't be out of the question to make another £800,000 on paper from that £800,000 in an intelligent purchase. So you'd effectively have doubled your money. You wouldn't be liquid anymore because it would be sunk into those properties, but you would create cash flow and you would have exposure to capital growth, which I think I'm pretty bullish on over the reasonably medium term, depending on whether our friend Mr. Polanski gets elected or not anyway, Duncan.
Excellent. Adam, it's great to join you. I mean, I look forward to seeing you next week in your Patek Philippe watch with your Melchior Honda Curta painting behind you. But until then, thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Duncan.